Hello, I'm John Hartnett, a sort of retired Episcopal priest, and I am continuing my reflections on the lectionary assignments for a given Sunday. And today we'll be looking at part of the Gospel for September the 8th. I'm going to be looking at Mark chapter 7, verses 24 through 30. Now, the whole assignment goes further, but I'm just talking about one of the healings, so that's the only one I'm going to read. Here we go. From Gennesaret by the Sea of Galilee, Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre on the coast of the Mediterranean. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came and bowed down at his feet. Now, the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and to throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home and found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. The word of the Lord. Well, let's put this story in context. A few weeks ago, we had the feeding of the 5,000. We spent a lot of time talking about that in the Gospel of John, but in Mark, it was just a couple of chapters ago. We had the feeding of the 5,000, and then last week we had Jesus confronting the Pharisees about his disciples eating with unclean hands. Now, note that there's a fair amount of attention in this story to where this takes place. The location matters in this account. Jesus is in Gentile territory. Now, maybe he's hiding from the Pharisees and Jews from Jerusalem who are coming up to give him a hard time before, and it's also not far from where he grew up in Nazareth. Jesus was by now famous for his healings, but he seems impatient with that. He approaches Tyre, a large port on the Mediterranean coast. Now, ports are famous for not being provincial. People from all over come there with their ideas, their customs, and culture. It's more sophisticated and maybe more complicated and cosmopolitan than some local village. And when Jesus gets there, what does he do, according to Mark? He says he entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there. He seems not to want to be known as a healer, just as he didn't want to be famous as a provider of bread to crowds. I suspect Jesus wants the attention to be focused on his Father. His mission is his subject matter, not on himself. But people want to focus on him, specific, immediate, tangible, and visible. And they went on to focus on what he could do for them on their terms, being fairly uninterested in the deeper issues that he himself wants to address. Now, a church that focuses on feeding programs but is less accomplished at talking about God and making disciples might think twice about how their priorities compare to those of Jesus, and if there is a gap, what ought to be done about that. Jesus is modeling an incarnational ministry. It's not a celebration of himself. He wants people to understand and accept what he says, not to celebrate him. Celebrating clergy should make us a little uncomfortable if we follow this example. Well, back to our story. A local woman hears that the famous healer is in town. Jesus' reputation, and this is, of course, a pre-media era, has preceded him, and that's quite an accomplishment. As Mark puts it, yet Jesus could not escape notice. The woman tracks him down because her daughter has an unclean spirit, and the woman is a Syrophoenician. Remember, Jesus is in Gentile territory. Whereas the Jews from Jerusalem criticized Jesus when they came to him, this woman, on her arrival, bowed down at his feet. She's neither described nor named. We don't know what her status is or what her position is in the society, but she's a Gentile, and that's important. She is not high status, and she is not in Jesus' target audience. He's there to talk to Jews about God. But she bows down and begs him to cast the demon out of her daughter. The daughter is not dead. Her illness is not physical as far as we know. She just has an unclean spirit. Now, so I'm guessing the daughter is a teenager and the mother is just exasperated with her, but that's my modern take on this. If there's a father in the picture, he doesn't join this embassy to Jesus, and maybe the mother didn't tell her husband that she was going. Maybe he wouldn't have approved of her going to the Jewish wonder worker. But that doesn't stop her from doing what she has set out to do. The woman shows courage and independence to act on her own to get something that really matters to her quite a lot. Socially, a woman talking to a man in this setting is a little edgy. Even that required probably some courage on her part, some willingness to defy convention. And Jesus brushes her off with a rude ethnic slur. He says, "Let the children," that is the Jews, "be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." Dogs, in this culture, being something like vermin, not household pets. Jesus insults her and denies that she has any right to ask him for anything. And anyway, remember, he doesn't want to be known as a healer. He's trying to kind of escape that tag. If Jesus were in the preordination clinical pastoral education program in the Episcopal Church at this point, he would get a failing mark for this encounter. But the woman doesn't flinch. She doesn't accuse him of being insensitive. She doesn't counter with her own sneer about stuck-up Jewish outsiders. She doesn't say, "How dare you call me a dog?" She doesn't hit back or collapse, crushed by his reaction. She stands her ground, unaffected by his tone, and calls him to task. "Sir," she says, respectful, "even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." The mother says there is enough for everyone. Remember, this is not long after the feeding of the 5,000. Everyone there is fed by what? By the crumbs that fall from the leftovers. It's almost as if she's taking what Jesus has just done and playing it back and saying, "Okay, you're used to providing abundance. I'm here for that, and not for myself, but for my daughter." And remember, the last time we saw the children, that is the Jews in Mark, they didn't want to talk about what was on the table, but whether or not the people who were there had washed their hands or not. Jesus is not entirely graceful, but he gets that she is right. And by implication, maybe he was wrong in his exasperation and impatience to brush her off so rudely. He tells her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." Now, it's interesting to me that he doesn't say, "I cast the demon out of your daughter." He just says, "The demon is gone." So one could argue that he's simply describing something that's happened rather than actually making it happen. The story is a little bit ambiguous about that. When Matthew tells this same story, he makes Jesus a little more gracious and hammers home the deeper meaning of the encounter. In Matthew, Jesus says to her at the end, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. So Matthew adds faith to the conversation. He says Jesus is the agent, "Let it be done for you," and announces that this has happened instantaneously with Jesus' pronouncement. Matthew takes this and raises Jesus' status quite a lot. Now, there's no declaration of instantaneous healing in Mark. He just says, "She went home, found the child lying on the bed, and the demon gone." No preaching here, just the simple facts. Maybe the mother knew maybe the daughter knew what her mother had done and realized how much her annoying mother really loved her, that she would go and risk humiliation from a Jew on her behalf. But maybe that's just my 21st century psychologizing. Jesus does not often get set straight in the New Testament. Today's story may be the most obvious time when Jesus changes his mind because of what someone says to him. But it reminds me a bit of Jesus at the wedding of Cana in Galilee, when it takes Jesus' mother's admonition to get him to deal with the shortage of wine. If you're keeping track, it's worth noting that in both cases it is a woman who calls Jesus to do what he has come to do and to be who he has come to be. Luke, who seems to have had a copy of Mark, leaves this story of the Syrophoenician completely out. And Matthew, as we have seen, cleans it up. So, what's going on? The big deal for the early church, and maybe their biggest sort of source of tension, the way we fight about sex or gender or race or something like that, they fought about what to do about the Gentiles. While the New Testament was being written, first century, the embarrassing, perplexing, and completely unexpected fact was that the Jews, largely, but by no means entirely, rejected Jesus, and the Gentiles, whom every good Jew looked upon as unacceptable on multiple levels, more and more the Gentiles accepted Jesus and sought to be his disciples. Peter seems to have viewed this development as an uncomfortable and inexplicable anomaly, while Paul saw it as an act of God to expand the community of the chosen people to all who chose to belong. Luke, especially, seems to follow Paul. Luke alone, for example, remembers the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, we're so used to hearing the Good Samaritan, we just think this is a guy in the Bible. But for Jesus's and Luke's audience, the word Samaritan would be a little bit more like Palestinian in Israel today. So to a modern audience, the Good Samaritan would sound like a modern Orthodox Israeli rabbi telling a flattering story about the good Palestinian. It would be shocking and completely unexpected. And that's how Luke expands the circle of who is to be included in God's mission to say, oh, by the way, this Samaritan actually got it when the people who passed by the injured man were all good, observant Jews, and the punchline at the end is, go thou and do likewise. Who's the example? Not the rabbi, not the Levite, it's the Samaritan. And also in Luke, at the beginning of Luke, at the end of the Christmas story, old Simeon holds the baby Jesus in his arms and declares that Jesus will be a light to lighten the Gentiles, and so be the glory of thy people Israel. Luke makes it very clear from the beginning that Jesus' audience is not just the Jews, but he's a light to lighten the Gentile. Luke has no Syrophoenician women in this story, as I mentioned, but he does tell the story of a Roman, that is to say a Gentile, centurion, who comes to Jesus asking him to heal his servant back home. And Jesus does it. In that story, Jesus treats the powerful Roman man with respect and praises his faith. After the centurion has said, but speak the word and let my servant be healed, Jesus turns to the crowd, presumably mostly Jews, and says, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. So in this story, it's the Gentile who sets an example for the Jews, not someone to be sort of let in by the back door, but someone to be looked up to. It's the same spirit as in the Good Samaritan when Jesus says at the end of that parable, go thou and do likewise. The Gentile, the outsider, the one we're all supposed to look down on, is held up to be the ideal. Gentiles are welcome. Outsiders, the unclean, are all welcome. But their Gentile status and culture are not particularly celebrated. Jesus doesn't declare Syrophoenician Sunday, or suggest that maybe the centurion's religious customs might be integrated into his next teaching. Everyone is welcome, but that does not mean that anything goes. Jesus does not lower the bar or simplify things in the hope of expanding his market share. What is of God is not enhanced by making it more accessible. At the end of the feeding of the 5,000 in John, he doesn't dial back the talk about eating his flesh because he knows it isn't doing well in the focus group. Anyone or any community which seeks to follow Jesus might take notice, dumbing things down, making things simple in the hopes that people who don't really get it might somehow be attracted or be more interested. It's not a methodology Jesus follows. The Syrophoenician woman, on the other hand, bows before Jesus. The centurion acknowledges Jesus' authority as greatly superior to his own. Had the woman with justification denounced Jesus for being insensitive, would she have had a better result in her conversation with him? She could have said that, but she didn't. Had the centurion asked Jesus to be culturally sensitive and first offer just a token pinch of incense to the emperor before doing his Jewish thing, would the outcome have been the same? And Jesus, for all of what might seem insensitive in the encounter with the Syrophoenician woman, with that desperate mother, he delivers the goods. So, Mark's story is not uncomplicated. I come away impressed by the focus, dedication, and courage of the woman. I'm impressed by the fact that Jesus recognizes that he needed to pivot. He, in effect, repents. And that, he says, in effect says, I was wrong. You're right. You've called me to account. I agree with you. And I'm struck by how Jesus and the woman transcend the cultural barriers between them. The story does not celebrate culture, gender, or ethnicity, but it is clear that none of those things finally is a barrier to the work of God and access to God. The reclusive and reluctant healer, Jesus, perhaps learns a bit about himself and his mission in this story. I wonder what we might learn about ourselves individually and collectively as well. Thank you.